Hello, class. So in the next three modules, we're going to be diving deeper into the three macronutrients in our diet: carbohydrates in this module, and then lipids, and then proteins. And so in this lecture, we'll be talking about carbohydrates. I want to discuss the origin, so where our carbohydrates come from, the different monomers and polymers, so the building blocks that make up these larger carbohydrates that we're typically consuming. A little bit of review about how these carbohydrates are digested, and then where they're stored and how they're used. So carbohydrates are typically shown in this ring structure because they form these rings with the various carbons and usually one oxygen filling up one of these corners. And so whenever you see a molecule shown with just lines with corners or with a ring like this, that is because it is an organic molecule or a plastic mostly made up of carbons. So lines with no individual element shown is typically showing carbons bonded to other carbons. And so each of these would have various oxygens and hydrogens branching off of them. And as I said, monosaccharides typically have one oxygen in one of these corners. And so carbohydrates are one of our three macronutrients, again, alongside lipids and proteins. This is our primary energy source. You could think of it as our active energy source. So whenever our body or cells are doing work, and especially when we are being very active and needing a lot of energy, our cells will prioritize using carbohydrates as the source of that energy. And so this is especially true for neurons and muscle cells that are doing a lot of activity. They use a lot of carbohydrate instead of lipids, which are our resting energy source when we're not as active. Lipids have a higher calorie per gram output, and so that is our go-to when we are resting. But carbohydrates for active energy. All carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So we typically see glucose being represented in a chemical formula with C6H12O6. But all monosaccharides have this chemical makeup. All monosaccharides are composed of 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, just in slightly different formations, giving them their slightly different effects and uses. And so we are mainly getting these from our grains, beans, legumes, from fruits, and our vegetables. And so all carbs on this planet start off as glucose in plants or some other photosynthetic organism. So plants have the ability, or again, other photosynthetic organisms, so like bacteria and protists, have the ability to capture the kinetic energy from the sun and use that to convert carbon that is in the atmosphere into organic carbon, which is sugar. And so that will always make glucose, which is our most abundant carbohydrate on the planet. And then glucose can be converted into other sugars like fructose and galactose, and then combined with other sugars to make the various larger polymers that we use, or that they use in various different ways. And so they can be simple as monosaccharides like glucose, or they can be complex like larger saccharides like starch or cellulose to perform different functions. So this is just a quick overview of photosynthesis. So we have a leaf being shown here. And so in order for photosynthesis to occur, each cell is going to need access to water, which they get from the ground. The roots will absorb the water that is in the soil and bring that up to the rest of the cells through their vascular system, through their xylem. They also need carbon dioxide, which they get from the air. So little pores on the underside of these leaves called stomata are basically breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen. And then using the kinetic energy from the sun, using light energy captured in the chloroplasts, they can then combine carbons from each of these carbon dioxides to form a glucose, C6H12O6. And as a byproduct of this process, they will be producing oxygen, which is the waste product for plants, which will be released back into the environment. And so in this equation, we have 2 reactants and 2 products. The reactants, what are reacting at the beginning of this chemical reaction, are carbon dioxide and water. And the products, what is produced, are glucose, which can be used or stored, and oxygen, which is the waste released back into the atmosphere. So we'll be talking about various types of carbohydrates. We have our simple carbohydrates composed of 1 or 2 monomers. And so this root word saccharide is referring to sugar. So carbohydrate, saccharide, mono, a prefix meaning one. So monosaccharides are a single sugar molecule. Disaccharides, di meaning two, or have two sugar molecules combined together. And then polysaccharides are what make up our complex sugars, which have three or more. And so these complex sugars, typically our polysaccharides will be much, much larger than just three. Complex sugars typically contain hundreds to thousands of monomers all combined together. So things like starch, which is the storage form of sugar in plants, glycogen, the storage form of sugar in animals, and then fibers, which is the usable like construction and structural type of sugar that makes up the structure of things like leaves and stems. So we get a lot of our fibers from those leafy or stemmy vegetables. So some example monosaccharides like glucose, again, the most common sugar on the planet, will usually be found with other sugars or combined with itself. And so glucose is basically what our bodies are going to be turning every other sugar into in order to be able to use it for cellular respiration. Fructose, we typically find in fruits and vegetables that have a sweetness to them. So like the sugarcane root, right? So fructose is the monosaccharide that can be used to create that sweet flavor. Galactose only ever exists alongside glucose to make up lactose in all mammalian milk products. We then have our disaccharides, which are two of those monomers together. And so depending on which monosaccharides are combined, that creates a different disaccharide. So glucose alongside galactose is what makes up lactose, again, in all mammalian milk products. This is our milk sugar. Maltose is made up of two glucose molecules together. This is what gives that malt flavor to things like beer and liquor or malt balls. It can also be a byproduct of our own digestion of these sugars or the bacterial digestion and fermentation of these sugars. And then we have sucrose, our sweetening sugar, which occurs with glucose and fructose combined together. And this is naturally occurring in fruits and some vegetables. And now our larger complex carbohydrates, we have our starch, which, as I said, is the storage form of glucose in plants. So we get these from like beans and potatoes, grains, right? A potato is literally a storage unit for sugar for plants. They're a storage organ, right? It is a root that is just stuffed with glucose combined together into these large starchy, or in these large starch carbohydrates. Glycogen is the equivalent for animals. So we store our excess glucose as glycogen, and mainly our liver. Some of it gets stored in muscle. And so as far as consuming glycogen, you're really only getting that in your diet if you are eating liver. There's not a whole lot in muscle, so we're really not eating a lot of glycogen. We're mainly eating those other sugars from plants. And then fiber, which is making up the structural elements of plants. This is much more compact. Our bodies have a really hard time digesting fiber. So really the only fiber that's being digested from what we eat is being digested by the bacteria in our large intestine. So what happens to these carbohydrates? Glycogen, which is not considered a source of dietary carbohydrate, meaning we're not getting it from our diet, we're not eating it very often. It's more of what we use, what we convert our own glucose into in order to store it. Starch is going to be digested and broken apart into glucose monomers, and then we can convert that into usable energy through cellular respiration, or store it again as glycogen. And then fiber, which again, we are mainly not digesting. It is helpful with regulating our digestive process, with making us feel more full, and we do get some useful byproducts of fiber digestion from the bacteria. But we do have dietary fiber that we're getting from our diet, those leafy vegetables that we're eating, like our whole grains. And then we have functional fiber, which is actually fiber put into our food, so extracted from plants and then added to food, such as cellulose and guar gum, pectin, psyllium are all common examples of fiber being added to food. And so the total fiber that you see represented on nutritional labels, if you see this term total fiber, is the combination of those two types. Okay, so how and where do we digest carbohydrates? So this should be review. We just talked about this in the last module, but chemical digestion of carbohydrates is going to begin in the mouth. So our saliva does contain amylase, which is that enzyme, right? Amylase is an enzyme that digests sugars. And then we have mechanical digestion occurring from our teeth and chewing, breaking up some of the hydrogen bonds, those weaker molecular bonds holding various sugars together. Digestion will then halt in the stomach. The hydrochloric acid in our stomach actually denatures amylase, and so that enzyme can no longer be active, breaking apart these sugars. And then carbohydrate digestion will resume and finish basically as far as what we are contributing to the digestion of sugar. This will stop within the small intestine. So our pancreas is going to release amylase and maltase in order to break down our different, sorry, I saw maltose in here. I thought there might be a mistake. So amylase and maltase, I believe this is a mistake. This is supposed to say glucose. Amylase and maltase will finish the rest of what our bodies are able to digest from these carbohydrates. And then whatever is left will potentially be digested by bacteria in our large intestine or will be excreted as waste. And so once our carbohydrates have been digested throughout this process and reach our small intestine, those individual monosaccharides will then enter the capillaries under our epithelial lining of our digestive system, of our small intestine, to then be traveled to the liver. In the liver, each of these monosaccharides will be converted into glucose if they didn't start out as glucose, and then they will be transported to the rest of the body through the bloodstream or stored as glycogen. So that is where we will stop here, and I will resume the next video talking about uses and roles, regulation, and an introduction to glycemic index and glycemic load.